The official record says 54 men died in the Vanderbilt Coal Mine collapse in November of 1908. The official record is wrong. The men who came up from the lower seams that month, the few who came up at all, did not bring out 54 bodies. They brought up something else, something the company physicians refused to put on paper, something the local newspaper printed once and then never printed again, something the Pennsylvania State Inspector wrote down in his preliminary report and then crossed out before he submitted the final version. What they found in the lower seams of the Vanderbilt mine, almost 400 feet beneath the surface of western Pennsylvania, was a chamber. A chamber that was not supposed to be there, a chamber that nobody had dug. Inside it there were structures, and inside those structures there were bodies, and the bodies were not miners. They wore clothes nobody recognized. They held tools nobody could identify. And when the company moved fast, when the bodies were brought up in covered wagons after midnight and buried in the unmarked western corner of St. Aloysius Cemetery, without names, without records, without funeral services, they were not burying the 54 miners. They were burying whatever those 54 miners had found. If forbidden history pulls you in, if you suspect that the timeline we were handed is not the timeline that actually happened, hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell. We dig up what the official record buried, new investigation every week. To understand what happened in that mine, you have to understand what western Pennsylvania actually was in 1908. We were told it was a frontier of coal and steel, opened up by hardy immigrants, gouged out by the genius of industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and Cornelius Vanderbilt II, whose family money quietly backed dozens of mining ventures across the region. We were told the land was empty before, just forests, just rivers, just the occasional Native American village. Nothing under the surface but coal seams laid down in the Carboniferous period 300 million years ago. That is the story. That is what every school book still prints. But the men who actually dug those mines, the men who went down with picks and carbide lamps and lived in company housing on company scrip, they told different stories. They told stories about cut stone where there should be only rock. They told stories about iron implements that came up out of the seams with the coal, implements that looked machined, polished, finished. They told stories about chambers behind the chambers, voids the surveys did not predict, walls that were too straight to be natural. These stories were collected briefly by folklorists in the 1920s and 1930s, then dismissed as immigrant superstition, then forgotten. But they were not superstition. They were testimony. The Vanderbilt mine was opened in 1894 near the town of Vanderbilt, Fayette County, Pennsylvania. The town itself was renamed that year in honor of the family that funded the operation, an operation that pulled bituminous coal out of the Pittsburgh seam, the same seam that fed the steel mills of Pittsburgh, Homestead, and Braddock. By 1908, the mine employed almost 300 men, most of them Slovak, Polish, Italian, and Hungarian immigrants who had arrived in the previous decade. They worked 12-hour shifts in the lower galleries where the heat was suffocating and the air was thick with coal dust. The company had cut a series of new shafts that summer, pushing deeper than the original surveys had recommended. The chief engineer, a man named Harlan Wexler, had argued against the deeper cuts. He thought the geology was unstable. He thought the seam dipped into water-bearing strata at 380 feet. The company overruled him. Wexler resigned in September. 2 months later, the lower galleries collapsed. The collapse happened on the morning of November 9th, 1908 at approximately 10:15. Witnesses on the surface heard what they described as a series of muffled detonations, 3 or 4 in rapid succession, followed by a long rumble that lasted nearly a minute. Dust came pouring out of the main shaft for almost an hour. The whistle was blown. Wives and children of the miners came running from the company houses on the hillside. By noon, every available man in the county was at the mine head, organizing rescue parties. The first crews went down within 90 minutes. They came back up with reports of impassable rubble in the main gallery, no signs of life, no sounds. By nightfall, the company had brought in additional crews from neighboring mines in Brownsville and Connellsville. They worked through the night by lantern light. They cleared rubble by hand, by horse, by primitive electric lift. They expected to find bodies. They expected the standard disaster of a mine collapse. They did not expect what they actually found. The first crew to reach the lower seam was led by a foreman named Joseph Krupka. Krupka was Slovak, 34 years old, 10 years in the mines. His own brother was among the missing. When his team broke through the final wall of debris at approximately 3 in the morning on November 10th, they entered what the survey map said should be a working gallery. It was not. The gallery had been ripped open along its entire length, and the working face had collapsed sideways into a void that was not on any map. Krupka's team held up their lanterns and looked into the void. What they saw stopped them. The void was not a natural cave. The walls were cut, dressed, finished. The floor was level. There were what Krupka later described as benches along the walls made of the same dark stone as the walls themselves, as if carved from a single piece. And along the floor of the chamber, partly buried in rubble, partly exposed, were bodies, many of them. Krupka counted at least 20 before his lantern began to flicker. The bodies were not the miners. They were dressed in clothes that resembled long tunics or robes of a coarse grey fabric. Their skin was preserved, dry, almost mummified by the conditions of the chamber, which Krupka said was unnaturally dry and cool for a coal mine at that depth. Several of them held objects. Krupka described one object as a rod of polished metal, about 2 feet long, with rings or bands at intervals along its length. Another body had what looked like a small box clutched against its chest. The box was made of a dull greenish metal Krupka did not recognize. Krupka pulled his team back. He did not allow any of them to enter the chamber. He went up to the surface and asked to speak directly to the mine superintendent, a man named Reuben Marsh. Marsh came down with 2 assistants and 2 company physicians, both of whom were on the company payroll and answered to the company first. They went into the chamber with Krupka. They were down for almost 2 hours. When they came up, Marsh announced that the lower seam had collapsed completely, that all the missing miners were presumed dead, and that the recovery operation in the lower gallery was suspended for safety reasons. He posted armed company guards at the mouth of the shaft. No further rescue attempts were authorized from that direction. For the next 4 days, the company brought up bodies, but only from the upper sections of the collapse. These were the bodies of identifiable miners, men whose families were waiting at the gate, men with wedding rings and lunch pails and pocket watches inscribed with their names. 12 bodies, 12 out of the 54 missing. The other 42 were declared lost beyond recovery, sealed behind the rubble of the lower seam. Their families received small payments from the company and were told not to ask further questions. But Krupka knew. Krupka had seen the chamber. And in the second week of November, when Krupka tried to talk to a reporter from the Uniontown Daily News, he was visited at his home by 2 men who said they represented the company's legal counsel. They did not threaten him directly. They simply explained that his job, his housing, his children's schooling, and his standing in the community were all things the company had given him, and all things the company could take away. Krupka stopped talking. But before he stopped, the reporter, a young man named Edwin Holsapple, had already filed his first story. The Uniontown Daily News printed Holsapple's article on November 16th. The headline read, "Strange Find Reported in Vanderbilt Disaster." The article described in 3 paragraphs what Krupka had seen: the chamber, the bodies, the unknown clothing, the metal objects. The article did not survive. The print run was small, and within 48 hours every copy that the paper could retrieve was retrieved. The plates were melted down. Holsapple was let go from the paper. He moved to Cleveland 3 weeks later and never wrote about mining again. He died in 1931. But one copy of the November 16th edition was preserved by a subscriber in Connellsville named Margaret Boyer, who had kept it because the same issue contained the obituary of her uncle. The Boyer family kept the paper folded in a Bible for 3 generations. It surfaced again in 1997 when a great-grandson sold the family estate, and a researcher named Daniel Kovacs found it in a box of papers donated to a local historical society. Kovacs photographed the article. The photograph still exists. The article is real. What was in the chamber? The official record gives us nothing. But the unofficial record, the testimony Krupke gave privately to his priest, the testimony two of the company physicians gave separately on their deathbeds, the testimony of a state inspector named Thomas Ellsworth, who filed his preliminary report and then was forced to revise it. All of these accounts agree on the basic outlines. The chamber was approximately 60 feet long and 20 feet wide. The ceiling was vaulted, arched, finished with what looked like the same dark stone as the walls. The walls had markings on them, lines or symbols, not random but arranged in patterns, running horizontally at about chest height. Nobody who saw them recognized the symbols. Ellsworth, who had some education in classical languages, said they were not Latin, not Greek, not any cuneiform he had seen reproduced in books. He said they looked, as much as they looked like anything, like a form of writing that ran in both directions at once, that doubled back on itself, that was not laid out the way Western writing is laid out. He could not read it. Nobody could. The bodies, Ellsworth said, numbered between 23 and 27. He could not give an exact count because some of them had been damaged in the collapse. They were of normal human size, neither giants nor dwarves, contrary to some later rumours. Their skulls were of normal proportion. But their teeth, Ellsworth noted in his preliminary report, were uniform in a way that human teeth are usually not. They showed almost no wear. They showed no dental work, no caries, no missing teeth. The teeth of working-class men in 1908, by contrast, were a catalogue of decay and loss. These bodies belonged to a population that either had access to extraordinary dental care or had never eaten the diet that destroys human teeth in modernity: sugar, grain, acid foods. None of those wear patterns were present. The clothing was preserved well enough to be examined. The fabric was not wool, not cotton, not linen, not silk. It was, according to one of the company physicians who whispered to a colleague years later in retirement, something he could not identify even with the resources of a textile chemist. The threads were too uniform, the weave was too fine. The fabric resisted ordinary water absorption in a way that natural fibres do not. Whatever it was not on the market in 1898 or 1908. It was not on the market in the 1800s at all. And yet here it was, on the bodies of people who had clearly been dead for a long time, in a chamber that had clearly been sealed behind solid rock, long before any modern person walked the area. How long? That is the question nobody could answer. The coal seam itself, by the geological calendar we have been given, formed in the Carboniferous 300 million years ago. If the chamber was contemporary with the seam, the bodies would be 300 million years old, which is absurd, which is impossible, which means either the bodies are not that old or the seam is not that old. Either possibility breaks the official timeline. Either possibility opens a door that the official history has spent the last 117 years trying to keep shut. Because if the bodies are recent, who built the chamber? Who walked down 400 feet of solid rock to leave their dead in a vaulted hall with carved benches and an unknown alphabet on the walls? And if the chamber is ancient, if the chamber is older than the coal itself, then the entire geological story we have been told about how coal forms, how long it takes, how the Earth's history unfolds, that entire story is wrong. Not slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong. This is the part of the story that the Tartaria question begins to come into, because the Vanderbilt mine chamber is not unique. There are other accounts. The Heavener letter from a coal mine in Oklahoma, 1912, describes a similar chamber with similar inscriptions. The Lawn Ridge coin from Illinois, supposedly pulled from a deep well in 1871, bears markings that no numismatist has ever placed. The Dorchester pot, dynamited out of solid rock in Massachusetts in 1852. The Coso artifact from California, 1961, with what looks like a manufactured ceramic core inside a stone that geologists insisted was hundreds of thousands of years old. over and over, when men dig deep enough into the earth, they find evidence of a civilization that, according to the official timeline, cannot have existed. They find walls, they find tools, they find writing, they find bodies, and almost every single time the find is suppressed, dismissed as a hoax, destroyed, or quietly disappeared into the basement of a museum where no scholar will ever request it. The Vanderbilt mine was sealed in the spring of 1909. The company announced that the lower seam was exhausted, which was a lie, because the surveys clearly showed millions of tons of coal still recoverable from that depth. They claimed safety concerns. They poured concrete into the access shaft. They drained the surface holdings. They moved their operations 2 miles north to a new mine they called Vanderbilt No. 2, where the geology was more cooperative and the seams were not, as a foreman later put it in a private letter, complicated by what lies below. That phrase, complicated by what lies below, comes from a letter written by Reuben Marsh to a senior Vanderbilt family representative in October of 1909. The letter is in the Vanderbilt family archives at a private collection in New York. It has been examined by exactly 3 researchers in the last 50 years, and all 3 signed non-disclosure agreements before they were allowed to read it. One of them, an economic historian named Lorne Faulkner, broke the agreement in 2004 by mentioning the phrase in a footnote of his doctoral dissertation. The footnote was removed from later editions. Faulkner himself died of a stroke in 2007 at 51 years old with no history of heart trouble. This is the pattern. This is what you find when you start to pull the thread. The thread leads back to a question that economists more than archaeologists have to confront. Because the coal industry of the 1890s and 1900s was not just an economic enterprise, it was, in many places, a recovery operation. The men who funded it, the Vanderbilts, the Mellons, the Fricks, the Carnegies, were sitting on something far more valuable than fuel. They were sitting on the buried evidence of a previous civilization, a civilization whose existence would destroy the legitimacy of the entire industrial age, because the industrial age sells itself as a story of human progress from primitive ignorance to modern enlightenment. If there was a civilization before us, a civilization advanced enough to leave finished chambers 400 feet beneath the Pennsylvania surface, a civilization that wrote in an alphabet nobody now alive can read, then the story of human progress is a lie. The story of who we are is a lie. The story of why we owe our labor and our deference to the men who own the mines and the mills and the railroads is a lie. So they buried it. They buried the bodies in unmarked graves in the western corner of St. Aloysius Cemetery, which is itself a strange detail because St. Aloysius did not normally accept burials of unidentified persons. The pastor at the time, a Father Mikusz, was a Slovak immigrant who depended on the Vanderbilt Company for the maintenance of his parish. He was, in effect, a company priest. He performed the burials at night, with no service, with no record in the parish book. 2 grave diggers, both company men, did the digging. The graves were unmarked. Years later, in the 1950s, a new pastor tried to map the unmarked sections of the cemetery and was met with resistance from the parish council, several of whose members were descendants of the original company officials. The mapping project was abandoned. In 1978, a graduate student from Penn State named Adelaide Brennan began a research project on labor history in Fayette County. She interviewed the surviving family members of the 1908 miners. She found Krupke's granddaughter, who still had a packet of letters Krupke had written to his sister in Slovakia in the months after the disaster. The letters described the chamber. The letters described the bodies. The letters described the threats. Brennan transcribed the letters. She submitted her dissertation proposal in 1979. The proposal was rejected. She submitted it again with revisions. It was rejected again. She was eventually granted her degree on a different topic, the history of immigrant fraternal societies in the coal regions, which the committee approved without difficulty. The letters were returned to the family. The family donated them to a regional archive. The archive catalogued them and shelved them, but in the catalogue they appear under a misleading title that does not reflect their content. They are still there. Anyone can ask to see them. Almost nobody does. What was in the chamber is, in one sense, knowable. We know there were bodies. We know there were objects. We know there was writing. We know the chamber was finished, dressed, vaulted, evidence of skilled construction. We can describe what the witnesses described, but what the chamber means, the larger question, is what the powers behind the Vanderbilt mine and behind every similar suppression have spent over a century trying to keep us from asking. They do not want us to ask who built the chamber. They do not want us to ask when it was built. They do not want us to ask what civilization left those bodies there, in those tunics with those rods and boxes behind walls of fitted stone 400 feet below the surface of western Pennsylvania. Because once you ask, you cannot stop. You start to look at the rest of the landscape with different eyes. You look at the older buildings of Pittsburgh, the ones that were already there when the city was small, the masonry that nobody alive remembers being built. You look at the canal systems of Ohio that no schoolbook explains adequately. You look at the cyclopean foundation stones in the courthouses of Connellsville and Brownsville, and Greensburg foundations the official histories say were laid in 1870-something, but which look, in close inspection, far older. You look at the maps of the so-called Tartarian world that show a continent here, on this side of the Atlantic, before it was called America, a continent already populated, already mapped, already industrialized in ways that the pioneer mythology refuses to acknowledge. The Vanderbilt mine collapse was not just a mine collapse. It was the moment a window opened briefly into the buried truth, and a small number of men paid by the Vanderbilt fortune, men paid by the systems of power that the Vanderbilt fortune was part of, slammed that window shut. They poured concrete down the shaft. They burned the newspapers. They threatened the foreman. They buried the bodies at night. They paid the priest. They issued the official report that said 54 men had died in a tragic accident in a coal mine. They did not say the men had died finding something. They did not say what was found. They did not say what was buried. And now, almost 120 years later, the Vanderbilt mine is a ghost. The town is half abandoned. The mine head is covered in honeysuckle and second-growth oak. The shaft is filled in. The records are scattered or destroyed. St. Aloysius Cemetery still has its western corner, its unmarked graves, its quiet rows of nothing. The locals say not to walk there at night. The locals say there is something wrong with the ground there. The locals do not know exactly what their grandfathers buried, but they know something was buried. The story has thinned out across the generations, but it has not disappeared. You can still find an old man in Vanderbilt who will tell you, if you buy him enough drinks at the bar, that his grandfather worked the rescue in 1908, and that his grandfather told him on his deathbed that there were people down there who were not from here. Not from this country. Not from this time. People who had been waiting in the dark for a very long time, until the company drove a shaft through their roof. If you have ever wondered why so many of the great industrial fortunes of the 19th century were built on extracting things from the ground, and why those same fortunes funded the universities, the museums, the historical societies, the journals that decide what counts as history, then you already understand half of the answer. They controlled the discoveries because they controlled the dig sites. They controlled the dig sites because they bought the land. They bought the land because they knew what was under it. Not all of them, not always, but enough of them, often enough, that the pattern is visible if you are willing to see it. The Vanderbilt Coal Mine collapse of 1908 is one node in that pattern. The Heavener find of 1912 is another. The Lawn Ridge coin is another. The Dorchester pot is another. Each one a small flare of light in a long darkness. Each one extinguished by the same hands. They buried the bodies without names, because to give them names would be to admit they had names. To admit they had names would be to admit they were people. To admit they were people would be to admit they came from somewhere, from some culture, from some civilization that fits nowhere in the official story. And the official story, the one the Vanderbilts paid for, the one Carnegie paid for, the one the great railway and steel and coal fortunes paid for, has no room for any civilization but the one they built. So the bodies got no names. The chamber got no record. The witnesses got no platform. The granddaughter's letters got a misleading catalogue entry. The reporter got fired, the state inspector got revised, the foreman got threatened, the priest got compensated, the pastor's successor got blocked, the graduate student got rejected, the historian got a stroke at 51. But the chamber was there, the bodies were there, and the truth, however buried, remains the truth. 400 feet beneath the Pennsylvania surface, sealed now under tons of concrete and 117 years of denial, there is still a vaulted hall with carved benches and an unknown alphabet on the walls. There are still bodies in tunics of fabric we cannot identify, holding objects of metal we cannot name. They were not miners, they were not from our world, and whoever they were the first thing the Vanderbilt fortune found when it dug deep enough into the earth, and the first thing it decided we were never supposed to know about. What they found in the Vanderbilt Coal Mine in 1908 was not a tragedy. It was a discovery. And what they did with that discovery, the burying, the silencing, the paying off, the threatening, the forgetting, is the real history of the industrial age, not the steel, not the railroads, not the cities, the cover-up, the long quiet, the unmarked graves in the western corner of St. Aloysius Cemetery, where the grass grows thicker than anywhere else, and nobody puts down flowers because nobody knows whose grave it is. There is one more piece of this story that almost no one knows. In 1923, 15 years after the sealing of the lower seam, a surveyor named Bernhard Vogel was hired by an independent coal speculator to map the underground holdings of the abandoned Vanderbilt property. Vogel was given access to the original company survey maps from the 1890s. He noticed something strange. The maps showed the upper galleries in detail with every drift labelled, but the lower section, the area where the chamber had been found, was simply marked as a blank rectangle with the words "structural anomaly" written across it. Vogel went into the old administrative office and found the original surveyor's notebook from 1893, the year before the mine opened. In the notebook, the original surveyor, a man named Pruitt, had made a marginal note next to that same rectangle. The note read, "Encountered worked stone at 380 feet. Recommend reconsideration of site." Vogel showed the notebook to the speculator. The speculator made copies. Within 2 weeks, the original notebook had disappeared from the office. The copies survived, sold at auction in 1971, now in a private collection in Pittsburgh. They confirmed that the company knew, before the mine was opened, that there was something down there. Worked stone, finished construction. They opened the mine anyway. They drove the shaft straight at it. And in 1908, when the lower seam finally collapsed into what they had been pretending was not there, they were not surprised. They were prepared. The covered wagons came too quickly. The guards came too quickly. They had a plan. They had always had a plan. But somebody knew. Somebody always knew. And the question for the rest of us is whether we are willing finally to know it too.